When I told my mother I was coming home to Savannah for a few days, there was a long pause on the phone that felt far longer than it probably was. I had just finished a demanding rotation overseas and finally had a short leave, the first real break I had taken in years. After months of sand briefings and the constant pressure that comes with leading people in dangerous places, the thought of going home should have felt comforting. Instead, the silence on the line made my stomach tighten in a way that felt strangely familiar. "Oh," my mom finally said, sounding more surprised than happy. "Well, does Brittany know you're coming?" That was the first thing she asked. Not how I was doing, not whether I got back safely, not even something simple like that she was glad to hear from me. Just Brittany. It was such a normal reaction for my family that part of me wasn't even shocked, but it still stung more than I wanted to admit. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the dull gray walls of my temporary quarters on base. "No," I said slowly. I didn't realize I needed to clear my visit with her. My mother gave a light, awkward laugh like I had made a joke. "Well, you know how busy she is. She's got a lot going on lately." Of course she did. Brittany always had something going on. My older sister had built herself a comfortable life in Savannah as a local influencer, the kind who seemed to know everyone and somehow managed to be everywhere at once. She hosted brunch events, posted lifestyle content, and appeared in photos with half the business owners in town. People loved her. My parents especially loved her. Growing up, Brittany had always been the center of attention while I was the quieter one who eventually left for the military and disappeared from the family spotlight entirely. "I'll only be there for 4 days, I told my mom. "I just thought I'd come by, see everyone." "Well, okay," she replied, still sounding uncertain. "We'll figure something out." Figure something out. Like my presence required scheduling approval. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, letting the old feelings settle in. I was 39 years old, a U.S. Army captain who had led operations in places most people couldn't even pronounce. And yet somehow the moment I thought about going home, I felt like the invisible younger daughter again. A few days later my plane landed in Savannah under a bright, humid afternoon sky. The air smelled like salt and warm pavement the moment I stepped outside the airport, and for a brief second it actually felt good to be back. Savannah had that slow southern charm that never really changed no matter how many years passed. I rented a car and drove through the familiar streets lined with moss-covered oak trees, passing places I hadn't seen in ages. My visit was supposed to be simple. For quiet days with family, nothing complicated. I also had a small personal plan that made the trip feel more meaningful. My boyfriend, Ryan Carter, was currently deployed overseas, and before I left base I had started looking for the perfect engagement gift for him. Not a ring for me, but something symbolic for him when he returned. Savannah had a few old jewelers and antique shops I remembered from years ago, and I wanted to find something that actually meant something. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, wide porch, the same rocking chairs my dad had insisted on keeping for decades. I carried my small bag up the steps and knocked, even though it was technically still my childhood home. My mom opened the door a moment later and smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a guest rather than your daughter. "Oh, Laura," she said, stepping aside. "You made it." No hug. No excitement. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like I had stopped by unexpectedly. As I stepped inside, I heard Brittany's voice echoing from the living room as she laughed loudly while recording something on her phone. My mother lowered her voice slightly and said almost cautiously, "Brittany's doing a live stream right now." It was my first 5 minutes back home, and somehow I already felt like I had arrived in someone else's house. By the time dinner came around that evening, the familiar tension in the house had already settled over everything like humidity before a storm. I had barely finished unpacking my small bag in my old bedroom when my mother called everyone to the table. The room looked exactly the same as it had when I was a teenager, the same wooden table, the same creaking chairs, the same framed family photos on the walls where Brittany always stood in the center while I stood slightly off to the side. My father was already sitting at the head of the table scrolling through something on his phone when I walked in. He glanced up for a brief second, gave a small nod that barely counted as acknowledgement, and then went right back to the screen. That was the entirety of my greeting from him. Brittany, meanwhile, was in full performance mode. She had positioned her toddler in a high chair beside her and was fussing over him with exaggerated affection while also balancing her phone on a stand nearby, occasionally checking the screen like she was still half engaged with whatever audience she had been talking to earlier. "Oh my God, today was insane," she announced before anyone had even picked up a fork. "The fundraiser this morning had way more people than expected, and the boutique downtown wants me to collaborate on a new campaign next month. It's honestly becoming a full-time job." My mother leaned forward immediately, her face lighting up with interest. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I told you people love what you do." My father nodded approvingly. "You've really built something impressive." I sat there quietly for a moment watching the exchange. The conversation moved effortlessly around Brittany the way it always had, like gravity pulled everything in her direction. Every story she told came with dramatic gestures, laughter, and constant praise from my parents. At one point my mom asked Brittany about her son's preschool plans, which led to another long discussion about parenting blogs, local events, and the amount of attention Brittany's posts had been getting recently. No one asked me anything. Eventually I tried to contribute, partly out of habit and partly because sitting there silently felt even more uncomfortable. "I actually received a commendation last month," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Our unit completed an operation overseas that—" "Oh right, you're still doing that," Brittany interrupted, waving her hand lightly like she had just remembered something mildly amusing. "Playing soldier." The words landed in the middle of the table like something sour. I looked at her, unsure if she was joking, but she was already smiling in that effortless way she had when she thought she was being charming. "You've been doing that forever," she continued with a small laugh. "I honestly don't even know what rank you are anymore." "Captain," I said calmly. My father chuckled awkwardly and took a sip of his drink like the whole thing was just light conversation. Brittany tilted her head slightly. "See, that's the thing I don't get. You're almost 40 and still running around in the desert with soldiers. Doesn't that get old?" My mother gave a soft laugh that sounded more nervous than amused, but she didn't say anything to defend me. I sat there looking down at my plate for a moment. In my world, that rank meant years of responsibility, leadership, and decisions that carried real consequences. I had led people through situations where mistakes cost lives. I had spent nights coordinating missions under pressure most people would never understand. But here at this table it was reduced to something childish. "Well," Brittany added casually while cutting her food, "I guess someone has to do it." My father nodded slightly again like that was a reasonable conclusion. The conversation immediately drifted back to Brittany's latest charity event before I could even respond. Within seconds they were all discussing guest lists and sponsorships like nothing had happened. I ate quietly after that. Each bite felt mechanical as I listened to the steady flow of praise directed across the table toward my sister. No one asked about where I had been, what I had done, or how long I had spent away from home. Sitting there, I was reminded exactly why I had left the moment I turned 18. That night, after dinner finally ended and everyone drifted back to their separate corners of the house, I sat alone in my old bedroom staring at the ceiling I had looked at thousands of times growing up. The room still felt frozen in time in the strangest way. The same pale walls, the same bookshelf my dad had assembled when I was 13, even the same faint creak in the window frame when the night air shifted. Yet somehow it no longer felt like a place that belonged to me. The dinner table had reminded me of something I had spent years learning to forget. In this house, no matter what I had done or where I had been, I was still the daughter no one really took seriously. Out there in the world I carried responsibility that most people my age never experienced. I had led soldiers through operations that required absolute trust and discipline. I had earned the rank I wore through years of pressure, training, and decisions that carried consequences far beyond myself. But the moment I walked back through this door, all of that disappeared like it had never existed. For a moment I wondered why I had even come back at all. Then I remembered the real reason. Ryan. The thought of him immediately changed something in my chest, the tight frustration slowly easing into something steadier. Ryan Carter was currently deployed overseas, stationed halfway across the world again like we both so often were. Our relationship had never been the kind people imagine when they think about dating. There were no long vacations together, no weekend getaways, no comfortable routine of seeing each other every evening. Our relationship had been built in the strange, intense spaces between missions, deployments, and long stretches of distance. We first met at a forward base years ago during a joint operation. It had been one of those places that didn't really exist on any map civilians would ever see. Dust everywhere, temporary buildings, helicopters cutting through the air at all hours of the day and night. Most people there kept conversations short and professional because everyone was focused on the work. Ryan had been different. Not louder or more dramatic than anyone else, just steady in a way that made people naturally trust him. The first real conversation we had lasted maybe 10 minutes outside a briefing tent, but even then I noticed something that was rare in my life. He spoke to me like my position, my experience, and my decisions actually mattered. There was no hint of dismissal, no subtle condescension, none of the quiet skepticism I had learned to recognize over the years. He never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself. Our relationship grew slowly after that, shaped by deployments, long messages sent across unstable connections, and the rare moments when we happened to be stationed in the same place at the same time. It wasn't easy, but it was real in a way that never required pretending to be someone else. Ryan never asked me to change my career, never suggested I should choose something easier or quieter. In fact, he respected it in a way very few people in my life ever had. That was why this trip mattered. Before I left base for my short leave, I had decided that when Ryan returned from this deployment I wanted to give him something meaningful. Not a traditional engagement ring, not some dramatic proposal moment, but something that quietly said what I had already decided in my own mind. I chose him. Earlier that evening, while sitting in the car before coming into the house, I had looked up a small custom jeweler in Savannah that specialized in engraved pieces. I had already decided exactly what I wanted. A simple bracelet. Solid, durable, something he could actually wear every day without worrying about it getting damaged in the field. On the inside of the metal I planned to have coordinates engraved, not words, not initials, just numbers that only the two of us would immediately recognize. The exact coordinates of the base where we first met. It wasn't flashy or romantic in the way most people expected engagements to be, but that place had been the beginning of everything for us. A dusty patch of ground halfway across the world where two people who understood each other's lives happened to cross paths. Lying there in the quiet of my childhood bedroom, listening to the distant sound of Brittany laughing somewhere in the house while probably recording another video, I reminded myself that this visit wasn't really about them at all. I had come back to Savannah for 4 days with a purpose. And tomorrow morning I planned to find that bracelet. The next morning I left the house early, partly because I wanted to get downtown before the shops became crowded and partly because I simply did not want to sit through another breakfast conversation that revolved entirely around Brittany's life. Savannah in the morning had always been my favorite version of the city. The air was warm but still calm, the streets quieter, and the long shadows from the oak trees stretched across the sidewalks in a way that made everything feel slower and more thoughtful. For the first time since arriving I felt like I could actually breathe. I parked a few blocks from the jewelry store and walked the rest of the way, passing small cafes and boutiques just opening their doors for the day. Harrison and Cole Jewelers sat on a corner with large display windows framed in dark wood, the kind of place that had clearly been in business for decades. The interior smelled faintly of polished metal and old wood counters, and soft lighting reflected off glass cases filled with watches, rings, and engraved pieces. A middle-aged man behind the counter greeted me with a polite smile and asked if he could help me find something. I explained that I was looking for a custom bracelet and that engraving was important. He showed me several options, laying them carefully on a velvet pad in front of me while explaining the types of metal and the engraving styles they offered. I picked up one of the bracelets, a solid band that was simple and strong without looking overly decorative, and turned it slowly in my hands while thinking about Ryan. The jeweler asked what I wanted engraved and showed me examples of coordinates and short phrases other customers had chosen. I was studying the small sample plates when the front door opened behind me and a familiar voice immediately cut through the quiet calm of the shop. "Well, look who it is." I did not even have to turn around to recognize Brittany's voice. When I did glance back, she was standing near the entrance with two of her friends, both of them dressed like they were heading to brunch somewhere expensive. Brittany's eyes moved over the display cases before settling on me with obvious amusement. "I didn't know you shopped for jewelry," she said loudly as she walked closer, her friends already smiling like they were waiting for entertainment. I kept my tone neutral. "Good morning, Brittany." She leaned slightly on the counter beside me and looked at the bracelet in my hand. "Wow," she said, drawing the word out with exaggerated interest. "Are soldiers buying engagement rings now?" One of her friends laughed. "It's a bracelet," I said calmly. Brittany tilted her head like she was studying something unusual. "For who?" "That mysterious boyfriend you keep mentioning." She glanced at the store clerk and then back at me. "I mean, seriously, have any of us actually met him?" The second friend chuckled quietly while pretending to look at a display case. I could feel the jeweler standing awkwardly on the other side of the counter, unsure whether to step away or continue helping me. Brittany clearly did not care that she was creating a scene. "You've been talking about this guy for what, years?" she continued. "Ryan, right? Are we sure he even exists?" I slowly placed the bracelet back onto the velvet pad and looked at the jeweler. I had dealt with far worse pressure than this in my life, and Brittany's need for attention was something I understood well enough by now. "I'd like this one," I told him. He nodded quickly, grateful to focus on the actual transaction again. "Of course. And the engraving." For a brief moment I considered the coordinates idea again, the original plan I had carried in my head since before coming home. But something about standing there, listening to Brittany's voice echo around the store while she tried to turn the situation into a joke, made another thought feel clearer. "Engrave this," I said calmly. The jeweler picked up a small notepad. "Courage, twice." He looked up briefly, making sure he heard correctly, then wrote it down. Brittany laughed softly beside me like she had just heard the punchline to something ridiculous, but I did not look at her again. In my mind the meaning was already clear. One for me and one for Ryan. The jeweler finished writing down the engraving and carefully carried the bracelet toward the small work counter behind the glass displays, clearly hoping the conversation happening beside me would quietly fade away. For a moment I thought Brittany might actually lose interest once she realized I was not going to give her the reaction she wanted. I had seen that pattern before. If there was no audience response, she usually moved on to something else. But that morning she did not stop. She shifted closer beside me, her voice still loud enough that everyone in the store could hear every word. Two older customers browsing watches on the other side of the room had already turned their heads toward us, and one of the employees standing near the door looked like he wished he could disappear into the floor. "You always do this," Brittany said with a sharp little laugh that carried more irritation than humor now. "You walk in somewhere acting like you're above everyone else." I kept my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the glass counter. Years of military training had taught me something important about conflict. The loudest person in the room was rarely the one with actual control. "I'm just buying a bracelet," I said evenly. "That's not what I mean," she snapped. "You come back here with your uniform stories and your secret missions and everyone's supposed to be impressed." I did not respond. Brittany leaned closer, lowering her voice slightly but not enough that it stopped carrying across the shop. "You know what the funny part is?" she continued. "You act like you're doing something so important, but half the time it just sounds like you're playing soldier somewhere far away where nobody can check if anything you say is real." One of her friends gave a quiet laugh, though it sounded a little more nervous now. I watched the jeweler behind the counter carefully placing the bracelet into a small tray while preparing the engraving machine. He was pretending not to hear the conversation, but his shoulders were tense. "You've always had this weird superiority thing," Brittany said. "Like because you left home and joined the army you're somehow better than the rest of us." I slowly turned my head and looked at her. My voice stayed calm. "I never said that." "You don't have to," she replied quickly. "It's the way you walk into a room. Like you're the serious one and the rest of us are just, distractions." I could feel several pairs of eyes on us now. "Brittany," I said quietly, "this isn't necessary." That sentence seemed to hit something inside her like a spark landing on dry grass. "Oh, there it is," she said sharply. "That tone. Like you're the calm, disciplined officer and I'm just some loud idiot embarrassing you." I did not answer. I simply looked at her. For a split second her expression changed, and I could see the frustration building in a way that had nothing to do with the bracelet or the store or even me standing there. "You think you're better than me," she said, her voice rising again. "I didn't say that." "You don't have to," she repeated, her jaw tightening. "Everyone knows that's what you think." Then it happened so fast that the moment almost felt suspended in slow motion. Her hand came up suddenly and before anyone in the room could react, her palm struck the side of my face. The sound was sharp and loud, echoing off the glass display cases and polished floors of the jewelry store. For a brief second the entire room went completely silent. No one moved. I felt the impact spread across my cheek, a quick flash of heat where her hand had connected, but my body did not react. Years of training had conditioned me to remain steady under pressure, and that instinct took over immediately. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I did not swing back. I simply stood there exactly where I had been standing, looking straight ahead, perfectly still while the silence in the store grew heavier around us. For several seconds after the slap, the entire jewelry store remained frozen in a stunned silence that felt almost unreal. I could hear the faint hum of the engraving machine behind the counter and the quiet shifting of someone's shoes on the polished floor, but no one spoke. Brittany's hand slowly lowered back to her side as if even she had not fully expected what she had just done. My cheek still burned slightly, but my posture never changed. I stood exactly where I had been standing, my hands resting calmly on the glass counter, breathing evenly and refusing to give the moment any reaction she could feed on. Then a calm, controlled voice broke through the silence from behind us. That was a mistake. The tone was not loud, but it carried a weight that immediately drew everyone's attention. I turned slightly and saw a tall man in his late 50s stepping forward from near the watch display across the room. He had the posture that military service leaves in a person long after years of training, the kind of straight-backed composure that is difficult to mistake once you recognize it. He walked closer, his eyes focused directly on Brittany. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you just struck a United States Army officer." Brittany blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting anyone to step into the situation. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" she asked defensively. The man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and calmly produced a leather identification holder, opening it just enough for the nearby employees and Brittany to see. "Colonel Andrew Hargrove," he said. "United States Army." The shift in the room was immediate. The store employees straightened slightly, and one of Brittany's friends looked like she suddenly wished she had never walked into the building that morning. Colonel Hargrove's voice remained steady, but there was a firmness underneath it that made every word feel deliberate. "You have just assaulted a commissioned officer," he continued. "I suggest you leave this establishment immediately before this situation becomes significantly more serious for you." Brittany looked around the store as if hoping someone would laugh or dismiss what he had said, but no one did. The manager of the jewelry store, a man who had stepped out from the back office during the commotion, moved closer to the counter. "I'm going to have to agree with the colonel," the manager said firmly. "Ma'am, I need you to leave the store right now." Color rushed into Brittany's face as the reality of the situation finally began to settle in. Her confident expression had vanished, replaced by something closer to shock mixed with humiliation. She glanced at me for a brief moment, clearly expecting some kind of reaction, but I simply remained where I was, calm and silent. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. Neither the colonel nor the store manager moved. After another tense second, Brittany spun toward the door with a frustrated huff. Her two friends followed quickly behind her, their earlier amusement completely gone. The glass door swung open sharply, and within moments they disappeared back onto the Savannah sidewalk outside. The store remained quiet for a few seconds after they left. Colonel Hargrove then turned toward me, studying my face carefully. His eyes briefly checked the faint redness on my cheek before he gave a small nod that looked more approving than concerned. "Captain," he said calmly. "Sir," I replied. For a moment he seemed to be evaluating something beyond the surface of the situation. "You maintained complete control," he said after a pause. "Most people in that situation would have reacted immediately." I did not answer right away. The heat on my cheek was already fading. Finally he gave a slight, thoughtful smile. "I've seen soldiers lose their composure under far less pressure in combat environments," he said. "What you just demonstrated took more discipline than most people realize." Behind the counter, the jeweler quietly resumed preparing the engraving machine, and the store slowly began to return to normal. But the silence that had filled the room after the slap was gone, replaced by something steadier. After Brittany and her friends left the store, the atmosphere slowly settled back into something resembling normal. The store manager apologized several times for the scene even though it clearly had nothing to do with him, and the jeweler continued preparing the bracelet engraving with careful focus, as if returning to routine would erase the tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Colonel Hargrove remained nearby for a short while, speaking with the manager and quietly asking if everything was under control before eventually giving me a respectful nod and returning to whatever he had originally been browsing. I finished the order for the bracelet, confirmed the engraving once more, and arranged to pick it up later that afternoon. By the time I stepped back outside onto the Savannah sidewalk, the entire incident already felt strangely distant. Situations like that tend to burn hot and then disappear quickly once you leave the room where they happened. I walked a few blocks through the historic district, letting the warm air and quiet city sounds clear my head. I stopped for coffee, sat on a shaded bench for a while, and tried not to think too much about the slap or the uncomfortable spectacle it had created. As far as I knew, the moment had ended the second Brittany stormed out of the jewelry store. What I did not know was that the moment had not ended at all. Inside the store, during those long seconds of silence after Brittany struck me, one of the younger employees standing near the register had quietly pulled out his phone. At first he had simply been recording the confrontation the way people sometimes do when something unexpected happens in public. But what he captured ended up being far more than just an awkward family argument. The video showed everything. It showed Brittany raising her hand and striking me across the face in the middle of the store. It showed the way the sound echoed sharply across the room. But more importantly, it showed my reaction, or rather the lack of one. The footage showed me standing completely still afterward, my posture straight, my expression controlled, my voice calm when I eventually spoke again. It also captured Colonel Hargrove stepping forward, identifying himself and firmly explaining what had just happened. Later that afternoon, after the store had quieted down again, the employee uploaded the video online. He did not attach my full name or any dramatic description. The caption was simple, something along the lines of "Woman slaps Army officer in jewelry store, officer stays calm." Within a few hours the clip began spreading. At first it moved through local social media pages around Savannah, where people quickly recognized Brittany from her online presence. Then it started appearing on larger platforms where military communities often share stories involving service members. The footage spoke for itself. Anyone watching could clearly see the contrast between Brittany's emotional outburst and the complete composure I maintained afterward. Comments began appearing underneath the video almost immediately. People described the moment as an example of discipline under pressure. Others pointed out that maintaining that level of calm after being publicly struck required a kind of restraint most civilians rarely witness. Some viewers noticed the colonel stepping in and began discussing the situation from a military perspective, explaining the expectations placed on officers even in personal confrontations. By evening, the clip had traveled far beyond Savannah. Military forums began reposting it with discussions about professionalism and leadership. A few online commentators referred to the moment as a perfect example of how training shapes a person's response to stress. Eventually, small news outlets picked it up as well, sharing the video with headlines describing an army captain remaining calm after being assaulted in public. What had been a brief, uncomfortable moment inside a quiet jewelry store that morning was suddenly being watched by thousands of people across the country. And at that point, I still had absolutely no idea it was happening. I did not learn about the video until later that evening. After picking up the bracelet from the jewelry store, I spent most of the afternoon walking through the quieter parts of Savannah, trying to enjoy the short leave I had before returning to duty. The bracelet felt solid and reassuring in the small box inside my jacket pocket, the engraving exactly how I had asked for it. Courage twice. One for me and one for Ryan. By the time the sun began to lower over the city, I finally drove back to my parents' house, expecting nothing more dramatic than another uncomfortable dinner. The moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was wrong. My mother was standing in the living room holding her phone tightly in one hand, her face flushed with anger. My father sat stiffly in his chair nearby with the same expression he used whenever something had gone very wrong and he had already decided who to blame. "There you are," my mother said sharply the moment she saw me. The tone in her voice caught me off guard. "What's going on?" Instead of answering directly, she turned her phone toward me. A video was playing on the screen. I recognized the jewelry store immediately, the glass counters, the display cases, the angle from somewhere near the front register. Then I saw Brittany step into the frame. I watched myself standing at the counter. I watched her hand rise. The sound of the slap came through the phone's speaker clearly. The video continued long enough to show me standing still, then Colonel Hargrove stepping forward and speaking. It ended just before Brittany stormed out of the store. My mother lowered the phone, her expression furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded. I stared at her, confused. "What I've done?" "That video is everywhere," she said. "People are sharing it all over the internet." My father leaned forward, his voice heavy with disapproval. "The entire family looks ridiculous because of this." For a moment I honestly thought I had misunderstood what they were saying. "Brittany hit me," I said slowly. "That's not the point," my mother snapped immediately. This was a private family conflict. I looked at her, trying to process the words. And now strangers are commenting on it like we're some kind of abusive household, she continued. Do you know how embarrassing that is? I felt something inside my chest tighten. I didn't record the video, I said calmly. But you let that man interfere, my father said, referring to Colonel Hargrove. You stood there while he threatened your sister. He identified what happened, I replied. My mother shook her head in frustration. You should have stopped it. You should have told him it was a misunderstanding. I could not help staring at her. A misunderstanding, I repeated quietly. Families argue, she insisted. Things get emotional. That should never have left the room. For years I had learned to expect excuses whenever Brittany crossed a line. Growing up, there had always been explanations, justifications, or quiet dismissals whenever she hurt someone with her temper. But hearing it now, with clear video evidence of exactly what had happened, felt different. It felt final. You've made Brittany look terrible, my father said, his voice flat. I stood there in the middle of the living room, listening to them talk about reputation, embarrassment, and public image. Not once did either of them ask if I was all right. Not once did they say Brittany was wrong. In that moment, something inside me shifted in a way I had never allowed before. For years I had tried to explain things to them, tried to justify my choices, tried to make them understand my life and the work I had dedicated myself to. I had defended myself through every dismissive comment and every quiet slight. But standing there now with the video playing silently again on my mother's phone, I realized something painful and undeniable. Even with the truth directly in front of them, they were never going to see it. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to defend myself. The house was unusually quiet the next morning. No one mentioned the argument from the night before, but the silence carried the weight of it in every room. My parents moved around the kitchen with the stiff politeness people use when they have decided a subject is no longer open for discussion. Brittany had not come by the house, and judging by the tension in the air, I doubted anyone had encouraged her to. I drank my coffee slowly at the table, already thinking about leaving Savannah earlier than I had originally planned. Around mid-morning my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, a Washington, D.C. area code I did not immediately recognize. For a brief moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, assuming it was some routine military administrative call, but instinct told me to answer. Captain Laura Whitmore speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and direct. Captain Whitmore, this is Colonel Dana Whitaker from the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. I sat up a little straighter without even realizing it. Calls from the Pentagon rarely came without a reason. Yes, ma'am. I'm calling regarding a video that has been circulating online, she continued. For a second I thought my stomach might drop through the floor. Yes, ma'am, I said again, keeping my tone steady. We've reviewed the footage, she said. Several members of senior leadership have as well. There was a short pause before she continued speaking. I want to make something very clear, Captain. The response you demonstrated in that situation reflects a level of discipline and professionalism that the Army expects from its officers. The words caught me slightly off guard. You maintained composure under provocation in a public setting where escalation would have reflected poorly not only on you but on the uniform you represent, she continued. That restraint did not go unnoticed. I leaned back slightly in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. The reason I'm calling, Colonel Whitaker said, is because the Department of the Army is organizing a leadership panel in Washington next month focused on conflict management and discipline in uniform. Several officers and non-commissioned leaders will be speaking about real-world examples of maintaining professionalism under pressure. Another small pause followed. We would like to invite you to participate. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. You're asking me to speak on the panel? I asked carefully. Yes, she replied. Your experience in the field combined with the situation captured in that video makes you a strong example of leadership in practice rather than theory. I glanced across the kitchen where my parents were moving quietly near the sink, completely unaware of the conversation happening a few feet away. The panel will take place in Washington, D.C., Colonel Whitaker continued. Senior officers, training command representatives, and several leadership development programs will be present. We believe your perspective could be valuable. The situation felt almost surreal. Less than 24 hours earlier I had been standing in a jewelry store trying to avoid escalating a humiliating family confrontation. Now the Pentagon was asking me to speak about it as an example of leadership. What began as a difficult personal moment, she said calmly, has become an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of discipline we want younger soldiers to understand. I exhaled slowly. Yes, ma'am, I said. I'd be honored. Excellent, she replied. Our office will send the details to your command and coordinate travel arrangements. When the call ended, I sat there for several seconds staring at my phone. What had started as a moment of embarrassment inside a small Savannah jewelry store had somehow reached Washington. And now, instead of damaging my career, it had opened a door I had never expected. Several weeks after the incident in Savannah, my schedule had become completely different from anything I had expected when I first arrived in Washington. The leadership panel at the Pentagon had gone well, and the discussions that followed turned into additional meetings, briefings, and leadership workshops that I had been asked to participate in while I was temporarily assigned to assist with training presentations. Most of my days were spent in conference rooms speaking with officers, instructors, and program coordinators about discipline, decision-making under pressure, and the complicated balance between personal life and the responsibilities that come with wearing a uniform. It was strange in a way. The moment in the jewelry store had lasted only a few seconds, yet it had opened conversations with people who had spent decades studying leadership. They analyzed the situation from angles I had not even considered, talking about emotional control, public perception, and the invisible expectations placed on officers even outside official duty. One evening after a long day of meetings, I was sitting alone in the small apartment the Army had arranged for my temporary stay in Washington. The city outside the window was quiet, the distant lights reflecting faintly off the Potomac. I had a cup of coffee on the table beside me and my laptop open, scrolling through emails and updates from my unit. Out of habit more than curiosity, I opened a news site that someone had mentioned earlier during a conversation about social media. I had learned that the jewelry store video was still circulating in various places online, though the attention around it had slowly started to fade. But the headline that caught my eye had nothing to do with me. It mentioned Brittany by name. At first I assumed it was another article about the video or the argument in the store, but as I read further I realized it was something entirely different. The article explained that Brittany's non-profit charity organization in Savannah had come under formal investigation for financial irregularities. According to the report, several donors had begun questioning where their contributions had actually gone after noticing inconsistencies in the organization's public financial statements. The investigation had apparently uncovered a series of problems. Large donations that could not be properly accounted for. Contractors listed in expense reports that no one could verify actually existed. Event budgets that appeared significantly inflated compared to the real costs. I read through the details slowly, trying to understand what I was seeing. The charity Brittany had proudly talked about at family dinners, the one my parents constantly praised as proof of her success, was now being examined for potential financial fraud. Several of the sponsors who had publicly supported her events had already issued statements distancing themselves from the organization until the investigation was resolved. Another article mentioned that 2 local businesses had withdrawn their partnerships after discovering that their names had been listed as financial supporters without their permission. As the story spread through local media in Savannah, the social circles Brittany relied on began reacting quickly. The same online communities that had once celebrated her charity events were now filled with questions about transparency and accountability. Some people defended her, but many others demanded explanations about the missing donations. The reputation she had spent years carefully building through public appearances, charity galas, and polished social media posts was beginning to crack in a very public way. I sat back in my chair, the screen still glowing in the quiet room. Part of me expected to feel some kind of satisfaction after everything that had happened between us, especially after the humiliation in the jewelry store and the way my parents had blamed me for the video that followed. But the feeling never came. Instead there was only distance. Brittany's life, the world she had built around attention and reputation, felt very far away from where I was sitting now. The collapse happening in those headlines belonged to a different reality entirely, one I no longer felt connected to in any meaningful way. A few days after the news about the investigation started circulating, I received a message from a number I had not seen in weeks. It was Brittany. The message was short and unusually direct. She said she was in Arlington for a few days and asked if we could meet to talk. There were no dramatic explanations, no emotional paragraphs, just a simple request and the name of a restaurant not far from the river. For a while I stared at the message without answering. Part of me considered ignoring it entirely. Our last real interaction had ended with a slap in the middle of a jewelry store and weeks of silence afterward. But something about the tone of the message felt different from the way Brittany usually communicated. It was stripped of performance. Eventually I replied with a short confirmation and agreed to meet her that evening. The restaurant sat on a quiet street in Arlington, a place with dim lighting and the soft background noise of people having quiet conversations over dinner. When I walked inside, Brittany was already sitting at a small table near the window. For the first time in as long as I could remember, she looked uncertain. The confidence she usually carried like armor was missing. Her posture was slightly tense, and she kept adjusting the glass of water in front of her as if she did not know what to do with her hands. When she saw me approach, she stood briefly and gave a small nod before sitting again. I took the seat across from her. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. "You look different," she said finally. "Washington tends to do that," I replied calmly. She gave a faint, humorless smile. "I've seen the interviews and the panel discussions. People talk about you like you're some kind of leadership example now." I shrugged slightly. "I'm still the same person." She stared at the table for a moment before speaking again. "You always were." The conversation paused again, the quiet restaurant sounds filling the space between us. Eventually Brittany took a slow breath and looked up at me with an expression that felt unusually honest. "You know why I asked you here?" she said. "I assume you're going to tell me." She nodded faintly. "Because I need to say something I probably should have admitted years ago." Her fingers traced the edge of the water glass before she continued. "I was jealous of you." The words came out quietly but clearly. For a moment I simply watched her. "You left," she said. "You got out of Savannah the moment you could and built this life that actually means something. You had missions, responsibilities, people depending on you. You saw the world. You mattered somewhere." Her voice carried a tired frustration I had never heard from her before. "I stayed," she continued. "Everything I did was about attention. Charity events, social media, networking, trying to keep people impressed with me. It looked successful from the outside, but it was basically a constant performance." I listened without interrupting. "When that video spread," she said quietly, "everyone suddenly saw me the way I really am." She leaned back slightly in her chair and exhaled. "But it's not like you're innocent in all of this either," she added quickly. "We've always clashed. You've always looked at me like I was shallow, like everything I cared about was meaningless. There was." Even now she could not fully separate honesty from deflection. "We both contributed to the situation," she said. "It wasn't just me." I let the silence sit between us for a moment before answering. "No," I said calmly. "It wasn't both of us." She frowned slightly. "You slapped me in a public place because you couldn't stand that I didn't react the way you wanted," I continued evenly. "And when everything collapsed afterward, you called it mutual conflict." Her expression tightened, but she did not interrupt. I met her eyes directly. "The truth is simpler than that," I said. "We were never really sisters." She blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "We were two people raised in the same house," I continued quietly. "That's all we ever had in common." For a long moment Brittany said nothing, and the distance between us felt clearer than it ever had before. A few months after the meeting in Arlington, my life moved forward in a way that felt steady and unexpectedly quiet. The work I had started in Washington continued to expand, and what had originally been a temporary assignment gradually turned into something more permanent. One afternoon I was called into a meeting with senior leadership and informed that I had been selected for promotion. Soon after that conversation I received official confirmation that I would be promoted to major and offered a long-term leadership position in Washington working with officer development programs. The news should have felt dramatic, but instead it settled over me with a calm sense of certainty. My career had always been built one step at a time through deployments, responsibilities, and decisions made under pressure. This promotion was simply the next step on that same path. Before fully settling into the new role, I decided to return to Savannah one more time. The trip was not about repairing anything with my family. I had already accepted that some relationships never become what people hope they will be. I did not expect apologies or sudden understanding. What I wanted was something simpler than that. I wanted closure on my own terms. Savannah looked the same as it always had when I drove through the familiar streets again. The oak trees still stretched over the roads with long curtains of moss, and the quiet historic squares still held the same calm atmosphere that had surrounded my childhood. But the city no longer carried the emotional weight it once did. It felt more like a place I had once passed through rather than somewhere I belonged. I did not go to my parents' house. There was nothing left there that I needed to revisit. Instead, I walked through the downtown district until I reached the same corner where the jewelry store stood. Harrison and Cole Jewelers looked exactly as it had the day everything happened. The same polished windows, the same warm lighting inside, the same quiet elegance that had once framed one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life. When I stepped inside, the jeweler recognized me almost immediately. His expression held a small, respectful smile, though he did not mention the incident that had made the store unexpectedly famous for a few weeks. "Good to see you again, Captain," he said politely. "Actually," I replied with a faint smile, "Major now." He congratulated me warmly and asked if I was looking for another custom engraving. I shook my head and explained that I wanted something simple this time. He showed me several options before I eventually chose a pair of small, understated earrings. They were nothing extravagant, just clean silver with a quiet elegance that did not draw attention. While he prepared the purchase, I glanced briefly at the counter where I had once stood while Brittany shouted across the room and raised her hand in anger. The memory no longer carried the same sting it once had. It had become something else entirely, a moment that marked a turning point I had not recognized at the time. I paid for the earrings and stepped back outside into the warm Savannah air. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the city again, I put them on for the first time. They were light and simple, barely noticeable, but to me they carried a meaning that had nothing to do with appearance. They were a reminder. A reminder that I had stood still in a moment when losing control would have been easy. A reminder that I had survived the humiliation, the complicated family dynamics, and the quiet expectations that had followed me since childhood. Most importantly, they reminded me that the path I had built for myself belonged entirely to me. The real victory had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about walking away with dignity and continuing forward into a life no one else had the power to take from me.